Let's now talk of the idea of a constitution. Usually when we talk of a constitution, we think about a constitution as a written document or a written text that usually embodies a framework for the structure of government and delineates the spheres of power among the judiciary, the legislature, or the executive. And it also talks often about rights and freedoms of people, but not always. So that is, one sense by which we talk of a constitution. But there is another sense of the constitution, as Ratnapala and Crow talk about, and that is the idea of a constitution as a living document. And in this sense, a constitution embodies the idea of a system of government. And we will explore these two concepts in a short while. And there is a third notion of a constitution, and that is the constitution in a philosophical sense that embodies the idea of a rule of law. And we will explore that as well. But let's begin first by talking about the idea of a constitution, which as a written text, which is the most commonplace idea by which we understand the notion of a constitution. And often when we speak of a constitution as a written document, it is typically associated with the idea of such a constitution being a paramount law or being the fundamental law of the land. And being the fundamental of the land, it means that, for example, that any law that is passed by Parliament or any subordinate legislation that the executive may actually enact, these laws must ensure that they do not contravene any provision of the Constitution, because any law that is inconsistent with any provision of the Constitution will be typically invalidated because they will be deemed, or it will be deemed to be unconstitutional. So in that sense, the Constitution as a written document is the paramount law of the land, it is the fundamental law of the land. And yet, even if, for example, we may have a written constitution, the question arises whether or not, if the presence of a written constitution actually ensures that there is rule of law, or is it possible that you can have a written constitution and yet not have rule of law? The rule of law being the idea that there are limits to the powers of political authorities, and that there being the idea as well that even if political authorities may wield political power, they themselves are subject to law. So that in general is the idea of rule of law. So I'd like to go back to that question now. Does it mean that if you have a written constitution, necessarily you have a rule of law or a constitution in the philosophical sense? And that will be important because there have been countries, and there continue to be countries today, where you have a constitution, but that written constitution actually becomes an instrument by which a person may, or a political officer, or the executive, or the president, or a prime minister may actually wield authoritarian power. There is a second dimension to the idea of a constitution, and that is the idea of the constitution as the system of government. If you were to rely solely on a written constitution to try to understand the framework of a government, you may end up being misled or probably deriving the wrong ideas. If you look at, for example, the Australian Constitution, you may begin to wonder as to where lies executive power. Because if you follow the Constitution, executive power lies with the Governor General in Council. And you would assume, therefore, that power is reposed in him, and therefore it's the Governor General in Council who is the most powerful person in Australia. And that does not seem to be the case, especially because in Australia we have actually the notion of the Prime Minister, who is, especially with his cabinet, who wields political power in behalf of the executive government. But the Prime Minister and even the idea of the cabinet is not in the Australian Constitution. So it is important, therefore, to try to understand the notion of constitution as speaking of a system of government. And in that sense, the way by which we try to understand a system of government is not just by looking at a written constitution or a written text, but actually to look at judicial decisions and political conventions that provide a sense of how a system of government actually works out. In particular, it is important that we speak of a constitution in the sense of a system of government, because even if you actually have in a country a constitution in the form of a written text, it is possible that you have a system of government where autocracy and authoritarianism exists, so that a written constitution actually just becomes a mere figurehead. It becomes a mere symbol, but actually connotes very little in terms of the rights and freedoms of people, because you have a dictator who may actually wield power notwithstanding, or who may end up wielding paramount power notwithstanding the existence of a written constitution. There is a third sense in which we look at the idea of a constitution, and that is the idea of a constitution in the philosophical sense. And what it essentially means is that if you look at the constitution in a philosophical sense, it brings up the idea of the rule of law. The idea being that even rulers and the power that they wield must be subordinate to certain enduring rules that apply to everyone, so that there is no single person who is over and above the law. The rule of law simply means that all men must be under the rule of law. And so that laws, for example, or the wielding of power cannot be based on the whims and caprices and the personal desires of ruler, but they must be based on enduring rules that are generally applicable upon all subjects of a state, including, therefore, those who wield political power. And the idea of the rule of law and the Constitution in a philosophical sense connotes the idea that it is there to prevent the abuse of power, especially by those who wield political power in government. It is very tempting, for example, for anyone who wields power to abuse it and to favor it, either himself or people close to him. Lord Acton, for example, said that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so that it is necessary that you have rule of law, so that even those who wield political power will not be tempted